Our next presentation is Sample Handling Operations, presented by Minda DiMaano, Tula Morales, Andrew Post, and Lloyd Williams of the California Air Resources Board. They'll also be joined by their manager, Jeff Wright, during the Q&A portion of the session.
Hello, my name is Andrew Post, and this presentation will go over the sample handling operations for media-based samples in support of the Ambient Air Monitoring Program. Today, we'll introduce the sample handling team and go over our duties and responsibilities. We'll discuss some of the common issues or challenges that we face. The team will also present some recent changes that have been implemented, as well as some changes that are being considered. Here we have a look at our sample handling team. Jeff Wright is the manager of the laboratory support section in which the sample handling team resides. I work on the LIMS team, but I'm also the lead of the sample handling team. I'm responsible for training new employees on the sample handling team. I'm available to help address questions and issues when they come up, and am able to fill in as necessary when one or more of our team members are not available. Minda, Tula, and our newest member, Lloyd, are the ones in the office on most days performing 95% of the workload. We've included our contact information on the bottom of the slide as well. Before we move on, I think it might be helpful to give you a visual representation on where the sample handling team fits in with respect to CARB. As you can see, we are part of the Northern Laboratory Branch, which is one of 5 branches in the Monitoring and Laboratory Division. We reside in the Laboratory Support section, which serves to support the 3 analytical laboratories in the branch. Our section supports the branch in many different ways, 5 of which are listed here and include sample handling operations. Our core team members will collectively give the brunt of the rest of the presentation. You won't hear from me again until the end. Tula Morales will start it off by describing the sample handling team's duties and responsibilities.
Hello, I am Tula Morales. So this slide lists all the programs that we support. Although there is some commonality with each program, there are differences between what analytes are analyzed, materials and supplies used, assembly and disassembly procedures, and the frequency in which sampling occurs. And to give you a rough idea as to our workload, we are currently seeing about 6,000 ambient air samples come through the sample handling room each year. Here is a table of the duties and responsibilities sample handling performs on a daily, weekly, and annual basis. To start off, for most programs, we have now moved to having sampling media assigned a LIMS ID prior to sampling. The Zontec 924 and the canister programs are still operating under the old methodology of assigning a LIMS ID after the sampling media returns from the field. We expect these last 2 programs to transition from the older barcode identification to an automatically generated LIMS ID in the coming months. Site operators will likely not notice the difference. We perform these tasks almost daily as needed. I will go over the rest of the daily tasks listed here in the first column in the next slide. So let's go ahead and move on to the less frequent tasks that we perform. In order to ensure the integrity of samples collected, it is essential that the sampling components of each are properly washed and stored on a regular basis. We generally do this weekly. Examples include washing the cassettes that carry PM 2.5 filters and the cassettes and metal canisters that carry the SAS filters. Certain programs like Zontec 924 and SAS require labeling samples with barcodes, and it is sample handling's responsibility to create, print, and keep a record of such barcodes. Additionally, sample handling is also responsible for marking filter cassettes for the PM 2.5 program with an identifying number. And on an annual basis, sample handling restocks certain supplies such as temperature indicators, denuders, blue ice, things like that, to hold us over for the following year. We also continually review our procedural documentation to ensure that it is up to date. These documents are helpful in training new employees and provide consistency amongst team members in carrying out our processes. Sample handling works closely with the laboratory analysts and MLD's warehouse staff to get media out to the field and back to the analysts for eventual analysis. Here I'll briefly describe the interactions and highlight the different roles. So first, program analysts provide sample handling with the sampling media. We then assemble the media in appropriate shipping containers and provide to the warehouse staff for shipment to the field sites. Once sampling is complete, it comes back to us via the warehouse staff, where we then proceed to disassemble the packaging. Before we provide the sampled media to the laboratory analysts, we have to log in the sampling information into our LIMS database, then peer review the data that was just entered, and then, if necessary, follow up with questionable entries on the field data reports with site operators. Once our peer review of the sampling information is complete, we provide the sampling media and corresponding field data reports to the laboratory analysts. At this point, any remaining questions about data entries from the field data reports are now handled by the analysts. Also, any invalidation decisions are also determined by the analysts. Sample handling does not invalidate any samples. The sample handling team encountered numerous issues during the course of business. Here we've highlighted a few that we'd like to share with you today. These can put a strain on resources, which can affect our ability to do our job in an accurate and timely manner. I will discuss the first one, and then Minda and Lloyd will discuss the next two. I'm sure that this first one, COVID-19, has affected all of work operations in some form or fashion, and hopefully the worst of the disruptions is behind us. But here is a brief synopsis of how COVID-19 affected our operations. So COVID presented some unique challenges for the sample handling team, in that we typically work closely together as a team in a small room. COVID and the subsequent policies that were implemented affected that. So this slide lists just a few things that we had to adjust to. As most of you know, the programs and the number of sites that we supported changed a few times since March of 2020. At the onset, all programs were stopped except PM 2.5 and PM 10. And then PM 10 stopped altogether, and the number of PM 2.5 sites supported decreased further in December of 2020. The full suite of programs restarted in spring of 2021, but with significant changes to the number of PM 2.5 sites. Adapting to this fluctuation created additional work for sample handling. All of these decisions were out of our control, and we had to adapt on the fly, like I'm sure most of you had to do as well. With little to no notice, our building was closed in a few instances, which kept us from accessing the sample handling room, any sample media that was present, and our supplies. Warehouse staff were able to intercept incoming samples, and we temporarily set up new operations in a nearby building. Occasionally, we had one or more sample handling team members unable to come into the office due to quarantine orders, which made it challenging to provide support. Our team of 3 was also limited to a team of 1 for much of the time since March 2020. This became manageable, though, due to the sharp decrease in program support. However, we are now allowed to have our full team on site again, but with physical distancing considerations. Minda will now present some continuing challenges we face related to the accuracy and completeness of field data reports. But before doing so, we would like to point out that the frequency of such occurrences seems to have decreased over the past year or two. But we do think that improvements can still be made.
Hello, I'm Inda Dimano. We would like to go over some of the most common issues we encounter on the chain of custody forms or field data reports submitted to the lab. The first one is missing and or incorrect data. I will elaborate this in my next slide. The second is illegible or unclear handwriting. It is always our goal to make sure that all information in our database are as accurate as possible. Unclear or illegible handwriting can make this difficult. The third issue is missing attachments, especially for the PM10 program. And the last one is the date format on the COC. As you can see on this slide, the sample retrieval time is prior to the sample load time. Aside from processing, logging, peer reviewing the samples, and other tasks, this is the most time-consuming issue the sample handling staff face almost every day. We send out follow-up emails to the site operators so they can revise or update errors on the COCs. It would be very helpful if COCs could be checked for errors prior to sending them back to the lab. For this field data report, it was unclear if the scheduled sampling date was July 22nd, 2021 or July 21st, 2021. However, since the start date was July 21st, 2021, it was assumed that the scheduled sampling date was July 21st, 2021. And this would be verified with the site operator. In this case, the site operator should have just crossed out the error and then rewritten the date with their initials. Some site operators are using 2400 hours as their stop time. Please note that in the case on the left, the date written is actually August 15 at midnight, and which is what sample handling staff will enter into LIMS. For consistency and data entry purposes, it is preferable to use 0000 to eliminate possible errors or misunderstandings. Another challenge that I know both site operators and the CARB laboratory analysts are keenly aware of is samples arriving at the laboratory warm. Lloyd will discuss this in the next few slides. Thank you.
Hello, I'm Lloyd Williams, the newest member of the sample handling team. So what does it mean for samples to arrive warm? In this context, we are referring to samples that arrive above 4 degrees Celsius. This temperature is derived from the Code of Federal Regulation and US EPA guidance. We assess temperature of the shipping containers during transport from the field sites to the lab for the programs listed on this slide. The programs shown in bold indicate that if samples arrive warm, they have the potential to be invalid. Filter mass weighing for PM2.5, PM10 low vol, speciation, PM2.5 mass could result in sample invalidation. If samples arrive warm for the other programs, a flag is given, but the sample results will remain valid. Whether or not a sample remains valid or not for the mass programs I just mentioned is based on a couple of factors that we won't go into detail here. Generally speaking, if samples arrive cold, which again means under 4 degrees C, the lab has 30 days to weigh the sample. If the samples arrive greater than or equal to 25 degrees C, then the sample is automatically invalid. If samples arrive greater than 4 degrees C but less than 25 degrees C, then the transport temperature is compared to the average temperature during sampling. If transport temperature is less than the average temperature during sampling, the lab has 30 days to weigh the filter. If not, the lab has only 10 days to weigh the filter. Don't worry about trying to memorize the criteria I just stated. Rather, it's important to know that if we receive samples warm for these programs, it could severely limit the amount of time the lab has to weigh the filter. And if the lab is not able to weigh the filter in time, the sample is invalid. So how often do samples arrive warm? We look at PM 2.5 samples since 2019, and we found that approximately 2.5% of the samples arrived above 4 degrees C, which is not too bad. We know that the temperature of the shipping containers during transport could affect the amount of time the lab has to weigh the filter to remain valid, right? So let's see how often the lab doesn't meet this weigh by date criteria for all samples. We see that the lab wasn't able to meet this criteria about 1.7% of the time. Again, not too shabby. And this number drops even further when we consider the samples that arrive cold, that is less than 4 degrees C. So let's see what happens when the samples arrive warm. Wow, we see that when samples arrive greater than 4 degrees C, the lab cannot meet the weight by date criteria by 36%. A big difference between samples arriving cold. Now that we see how shipping samples warm can increase the potential for samples to go invalid, what steps can we take to minimize this chance? There are a few different parties in play here, and all of us can play a role in minimizing shipping samples warm. Most of these are long-standing practices, but looking them over here can serve as a nice reminder of what we all can do now that we see the dramatic consequences if samples are transported warm. I like to highlight a few items. With approval from upper management, the warehouse instituted overnight shipping of media both to and from the field. This was due to the dramatic delay in UPS service we observed during the beginning of COVID. It looks like this feature will be here to stay for the time being. We're told the regular ground shipment typically took 2 to 3 days to ship depending on location. So with next day shipping, we've been able to reduce that time by 1 to 2 days. Overnight shipping also greatly reduced the chance that delayed samples would end up sitting in a UPS warehouse over the weekend. In addition, sample handling is revisiting the way it's historically monitored the degradation of blue ice packs and will be making changes to its procurement process, inventory tracking, and degradation assessment of the ice packs. So all of the team members are assessing the quality of them in a consistent manner and replacing them as needed. And finally, it is very important that activated temperature strips not be placed onto a warm or hot surface. If possible, they should be placed either onto a cold surface, for example, a pre-refrigerated PM 2.5 canister, or just kept in the plastic Ziploc next to the COC. Also, please do not stick the temperature strips onto the COC. Tula will now discuss some changes we recently implemented.
So as was shown on an earlier slide, we are now able to more precisely assess temperature of post-sampling filters during transport. We accomplished this by using 2 additional temperature strips, the 10 degrees Celsius and the 20 degrees Celsius. Having these 4 indicators allows for a more precise assessment of transport temperature of the shipping containers from the field, which could help us decrease the number of invalid warm samples. For the chemical speciation network samples, we went from taking the temperature manually upon receipt to the use of temperature indicators, which is consistent with the historical practices of the PM 2.5 FRM samples, as well as the Zontec 924 program. We've already discussed the change to overnight shipping, but I wanted to highlight this change here as well. The sample handling team, as well as the LIMS team, working with all of the laboratory analysts, are looking into potential changes, which Minda will now present on.
Sample handling will be assessing the use and benefits of reusable minimum, maximum thermometers in lieu of temperature strips. This would add much more precision to the assessment of transport temperature in comparison to the temperature strips that we now use. And as we described earlier, this increased precision could allow more time for the lab to weigh samples that do arrive warm. In addition, continuous temperature data are able to be stored. Therefore, it is possible that samples arriving warm could be investigated to determine where and when problems occurred. Finally, they are reusable, meaning their implementation should result in cost savings over time. We are in the process of purchasing a small number to test before we move to full implementation. We mentioned in the beginning of the presentation that we are almost finished with logging sampling media into our LIMS database before the media goes out to the field. This has allowed us to fill in certain portions of the reports before the reports are printed, like the site name. This is already occurring for most programs. We are considering adding the sampling date as a pre-printed field. We know that this would be a big change from historical practices and that site operators like the flexibility to move the sampling media to a different site or schedule sampling date if the situation calls for it. We'd like to point out that this still could be done by merely crossing the site name or sampling date out in pen and writing in the new information. Printing the scheduled sampling date on the field data reports before they are sent to the field would give the lab greater ability to track samples from cradle to grave, something that is currently missing. In addition, US EPA has asked CARB to populate missing scheduled samples into their AQS database. This is very difficult to do without assigning every EPA scheduled sample with a LIMS ID before they go out into the field. More on this to come. We are just providing a heads up for now. I will now pass the presentation back to Andrew.
To wrap things up, there is a lot of work that we put into every single sample. Dishwashing, sample preparation, data entry, and peer review are all performed with care for each sample that goes through sample handling. One of our goals at MLD is to provide accurate, complete, and timely data to our clients. The only way to achieve this is for field staff, lab analysts, and sample handling to work closely together and maintain good communication. We are always looking for ways to improve and streamline our processes, to make our work more accurate and to ensure sample validity. Thank you for your time. We welcome any questions that you may have.
Thank you, presenters. If you could please join me on screen for the live Q&A discussion, and attendees, if you could please type your questions into the Q&A chat, and we'll go ahead and get started. We do have one question. Do you have an expedited protocol for filters that arrive warm, i.e. moving them up in the line or notifying the PM labs so they have a greater chance of being valid? Or is it always first in, first weighed procedure? Summertime in the Central Valley is super hot and the UPS trucks don't have any AC in the back.
Yes, I will take that question. And yes, we do have an expedited protocol. We sample handling immediately notifies the analysts when any samples come in greater than 4 degrees, and we process them before we end up processing all the other samples, so they get into the lab and can start their pre-weigh process as soon as possible.
Thank you. What products or machines are utilized by the sample handling team to perform washing of the filter holders?
We have some laboratory grade washing machines, dishwashers, not washing machines.
Should site operators continue to avoid shipping on Thursdays? Sometimes even next day delivery might not arrive on time.
Yeah, I mean, it kind of all depends on where you're shipping from, but I would say that shipping earlier in the week is obviously much more preferable, because you never know what could happen. UPS has been, as was mentioned in the presentation, fairly unreliable. They've gotten better now, but you still can't say what's going to happen.
Thank you, Andrew. Does anyone have any more questions? Has there been any consideration for digital files for chain of custodies?
Well, so I'm part of the LIMS team, and we've kind of, thought about that idea. It's would be much further down the line if we go that way. Nothing planned at the moment.
Great, thank you. Any more questions? Last call for questions. One more. Are sample 901 air canisters safe for returning to sample handling via 2-day ground shipping instead of 1 day?
By safe, I mean, do you just mean that because there's not necessarily a temperature requirement on them? Is that the...
Likely.
Yeah. Probably, but I think just for consistency, we're continuing to provide. I think we provide overnight shipping for all samples, and I think for the future, or for the foreseeable future, that's going to continue to be the case. But
Great,
yes, in theory, they would be safe.
Thank you, Andrew. I'll give you guys a few more moments to type your questions into the Q&A chat. If those are all the questions you have for the sample handling team today, we'll go ahead and end the session early. Monica Stant expresses her appreciation for everything the sample handling team does. So the next session is slated to start at 11:15 on the 2020 ozone TAD. So thank you everyone for attending this session.